All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Joe Schollaert with AFIMAC. I want to thank everybody for taking their time out today to join us for our webinar on hurricane preparedness. Appropriately, we've titled this where, since there hasn't been a lot of activity in recent years, don't let the past year soften your planning, and really discuss about how not to become complacent as it relates to the activity. So a little bit for those who aren't familiar with our organization, we've been in the disaster response space for over 30 years with extensive experience in natural disasters as well, and providing support services and helping companies prepare for and build a contingency plan as it relates to keeping their businesses productive and in line or online, so to speak, during a natural disaster. Some of the things that we're going to look at today as it relates to developing that plan and making sure that you have an adequate plan in place and it's communicated properly throughout your enterprise, as well as all those players who are involved in the process or anyone who might be impacted as a result of the storm. We'll review some of those things as it relates to this hurricane facts, some basic facts regarding a hurricane, some of the items relative to a security or a hurricane preparedness plan, what those objectives of your plan should be, as well as the types of zones that are identified during a natural disaster. A key item will be understanding and knowing the vulnerabilities of your business. Not only the vulnerabilities, but also evacuation routes that have been identified already by the municipalities or governmental agencies. Some general hurricane preparation items, also in preparing your facility for a hurricane or a major storm. Even if it's not a Category 1 or above and it's a tropical depression or a tropical storm, you still may need to have your facility adequately prepared. What to do if a hurricane watch is issued, some of the items to take into consideration and what to do during a hurricane as well as after the hurricane. Recovery activity, some of those things that you may need to look at as you recover from the effects of that storm that went through, and then we'll go through some conclusions on a summary of all those items that we've reviewed during the program. Some hurricane facts. It's a little unusual when we're looking at this as we're preparing for the hurricane season that just started in 2016. A little unusual because actually this is the historic period from the standpoint that as we've gotten underway with this 2016 hurricane season, May 31st actually marked a record 127 consecutive months since a major hurricane had made landfall, excuse me, in the continental U.S. And that's straight from statistics released by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. A major hurricane is defined as anything a Category 3 or above. So there have been some others, but nothing that has reached a Category 3, 4, or 5 to hit the U.S. mainland. And the last one to do that was Hurricane Wilma, back as it made landfall in Florida back in October of 2005. So as you can see, as when we started the presentation today, my comment about complacency and the fact that it's been a number of years since businesses may have had to look at this potential impact on their businesses. So, you know, in excess of almost 10 years, some organizations may have shelved that or haven't pulled out their hurricane and or disaster plan for a while to look at it just because of a lack of activity. So it's important to do so. Actually, this hurricane season has actually started off fairly active with 3 named storms already. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of the predictions for this year as well. A couple more slides into the presentation and the webinar. Although a major hurricane typically strikes the U.S. once about every 2 years, as I mentioned, it's been 10.5 years since one's hit. This is only the second longest stretch between major hurricane strikes. Last back in August of 1860 and September of 1869, from what records indicate. So this is the 3rd longest stretch between September of 1900 and October of 1906. So you can see that lack of activity that's occurred and the importance to make sure that you remain vigilant on your preparedness plans and have those updated even though there has been a lack of activity. The current drought in the major hurricane activities is truly a rare event, and from historical information, it really only, a drought like this really only occurs about every 177 years. So you're fortunate in your lifetime to be part of a historic event, I guess. So as it relates to the 2016 season, these were recently released. Actually, on May 27th, NOAA released the hurricane season outlook as they project for the upcoming hurricane season. And you'll notice that based upon the analytics that they utilize, they predict that there's going to be 10 to 16 named storms during this season. Again, I mentioned they've already had 3 in just the first, in essence, 2 weeks of the season. They anticipate those storms developing into hurricanes 4 to 8 times. And of those 4 to 8 hurricanes, they anticipate a major hurricane 1 through 4. Again, a good barometer, so to speak, to look at how accurate these have been in the past. Is kind of on the eye of the beholder, so to speak, but NOAA does a pretty good job of from a predictive model on understanding exactly what you're looking at. So from that standpoint, whether it's 1 or 4, if a major hurricane does hit, it doesn't matter if it's 1 time or 4 times, it's going to have a major impact on your business. So you have to be prepared for the one that may hit this year and impact your business. On average, there's about 12 storms. If you go back and look over the predictive models over the years, 6 of those become hurricanes, primarily over the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico probably having the most as it relates to that. And hurricanes generate a series of threats to lives and property. Obviously, threats posed to buildings and equipment and people due to high winds, which are kind of characteristic for these such storms. But there's also a serious threat to life and property comes from the storm surge, which everybody's very familiar with the high winds and the rain that may accompany that. But the storm surge in the coastal areas probably has the most dramatic effect. I.e. what happened with Katrina and the storm surge was quite honestly the major impact during that storm. The National Weather Service rates hurricanes on their intensity, and they're basically using a scale from 1 to 5. A Category 1, which has winds of 74 to 95 miles per hour, it's going to produce a storm surge of about 3 to 5 feet above normal tide. Category 2 has winds of 96 to 110, and that storm surge generally averages 9 to 12 feet. Same thing with the Category 3 as far as the storm surge is concerned, but the wind increases pretty dramatically from 111 to 130 miles per hour. In the past, as you mentioned, or as I mentioned earlier, the lack of those storms hitting a Category 3. There have been a number that were Category 1 or 2s, but those aren't as devastating as those that hit a 3, 4, or a 5. A 4 being winds of 131 to 155 miles per hour and storm surge of up to 18 feet. And a Category 5, which is in excess of 155 mile per hour winds and a storm greater, or a storm surge greater than 18 feet above normal tide. Categories 3, 4, and 5 have the most devastating effect, obviously, and quite honestly, that's when a lot of these plans that you may have in place or look to put into place would be actually actioned based upon those categories. Hurricanes are violent storms which really bring intense winds, heavy rains, the storm surges, the flooding, coastal erosion. You have to be concerned about landslides, as well as, quite honestly, spin-off tornadoes as a result of the atmospheric pressure changes. While it's difficult to predict, the exact time and place, there's actually a very good pattern that you'll see, and you've probably seen, where they'll predict the cone that the potential hurricane may travel in, and it could vary based upon wind and water temperature and things of that nature as far as the direction. But they have a pretty good idea of kind of that cone that hurricane may travel. Hurricane season runs from June through November. The major hurricanes that have hit have always actually come towards the end of the season, quite honestly, in the September, October time frames. Really, as the temperatures rise and the water temperature rises in the Gulf as well as the Atlantic, that tends to spin off more of those depressions and or tropical storms that then escalate into those hurricanes. They do expect, just as last year, I should say, an active season this year. There's a 70% likelihood of 13 to 20 named storms, even though that they are in fact kind of optimistic on the lower end. But those Category 3 or 4s, I think, have the possibility to run in that 3 to 6 major hurricane level of a Category 3, 4, or 5. So with that said, and all that information, you can see that the potential negative impact that it might have on a business that's located in that geographical area that a hurricane strikes. So the purpose of developing a plan is really to establish an efficient means of providing a continuity of your operations. Obviously, this is a short-term impact, hopefully, that you need to make sure that your business is positioned so that you can get up and run as soon as you can, or make sure that you're producing again or meeting your customers' expectations in the most expeditious manner. You need to make sure that you're preparing for not only the hurricane, but severe storms that might cause some general flooding as well as structural damage, and implement those procedures and policies to help with your overall business continuity plan. And that's something I'd really like to stress as you listen to kind of the crux of the webinar today to be on hurricanes and storm preparedness. But quite honestly, this specific hurricane preparedness plan really should be part of a much larger, overreaching business continuity plan that would just be a piece of it. There are many other things that would impact your business outside of natural disasters or storms. So this really should be only one piece of your overall business continuity plan that looks at your business from a holistic approach on any business interruption. So what should be your objectives of your plan? They're pretty simple. They're not too obtrusive to making sure that you can get a good plan in place. You need to make sure that you have an effective plan to continue those operations during storm conditions, or resume those operations if you have to close as a result of the severity of the storms. And you need to do that in a manner that will leave your business with normal utility service and without means of obtaining outside assistance. Take all those things into consideration of the things that you have on a daily basis. What will you do if you don't have those services? Outline each of your department's responsibilities. This isn't a one-person job. You may have one individual who is designated to develop the plan or spearhead the plan development, and maybe that individual who's responsible should you engage the plan to make sure that things are carried out. But this is not a one or a two-person undertaking or initiative. This is going to take a lot of support from a lot of different people, so you need to make sure that each department or operating unit within your business understands their roles and what to do if in fact you do engage the plan or need to put it into practice. Provide this in a logical manner and provide a flexible chain of command to allow maximum use of the resources during a hurricane. So you may have communication problems that occur during a natural disaster. So take into consideration that you make sure that you have some type of chain of command that's in place, and that you'll also have an alternatives, and that you have flexibility in being able to disseminate information as well as people get information from you. You want to minimize the injury to illness and illness to people, limit the damage or the loss of property and or records, and that's really one of those areas that people don't think a lot about. And even though there are many more records that are stored electronically or in hotspots or cloud services, whatever the case may be, you need to make sure that it's not only paper records but also those electronic records are managed in a way that you can access those or actually recover those in the event of a storm. You want to provide the maximum safety and protection for your employees and visitors, and that's paramount and that's key. Probably, even though it's listed here as kind of number 5 objective, obviously those assets of your organization, which are really people, property, and information, that people piece of it comes to the forefront and should be top of mind, and making sure when you're developing your plan that you do have adequate safety and protection for your employees. So let's talk a little bit of the types of zones that there are when you're looking at that. There are many, obviously, emergency management offices located within your state or your county, your region, parish, whatever the case may be. And you can generally find these easy enough, whether it's through the old school telephone book or a paper bunch, or through a Google search or some type of internet search that would allow you to identify the emergency management office and emergency operations nearest to you. Sometimes they might even be listed under the fire department or the police department as a subcategory there. So when you look at the zones that are identified, you really have 2 that you deal with. First of all would be an evacuation zone, and these are generally coastal areas which there is a danger for both the strong winds and storm surges. You got to take specific note that if your business is located in an evacuation zone, you need to make sure you plan for both the high winds and high water. Make sure that you take into consideration that storm surge impact. And then there's contingency zones, and these zones are really ones that are outside of that storm surge area and that flooding area, but they're going to be affected by the rains and the high winds primarily from a major hurricane. Some of these zones will extend many, many miles inland, and there may be an impact as a result of those winds that don't die down even though the storm makes landfall and carries over land for a while. Those winds may remain to be high and have a bigger impact on these contingency zones. Businesses that are located in either type of those zones really need to make sure that they have a preparedness plan. It's a good idea to Develop a plan of action for your business and have your staff ready for that type of disaster. Contact local emergency management staff to determine if your business is in a hurricane evacuation or a contingency zone. Make sure that you understand exactly the potential impact based upon the geographical location of your business. Some of the things that you need to look at from the standpoint of vulnerability of your business, geographical information, again, and infrastructure knowledge of your location, as I just mentioned, is of great benefit. If you know the elevation of your facility above sea level, it gives you an idea of what the potential impact is going to be to you. Know the condition of your building. So are you operating in a relatively new building? Is it one that's been around for many years? What's the structural resiliency of your building to take a major storm hit? Are there areas of your building that you're aware of that need repair or that may have some need for attention? Make sure that you have that documented so that if you're in process of trying to move that through on a capital expenditure plan, whatever the case may be, and it hasn't been done, you at least know the vulnerabilities and kind of those weak areas of your building as a result of having that drafted. And depending upon the severity of the hurricane and its projected path, as I mentioned, it can be a very wide path that's projected, but local officials may recommend that you evacuate people in the evacuation zones only for those in both evacuation and contingency zones. Obtain the information on the specific evacuation routes. You're all probably very familiar with those. If you aren't, they're easily identified. They're generally signage that's blue and white that talks about an evacuation zone. These are developed by your local emergency management or governmental agencies. Get an estimate on those travel times on those routes as well. Understand exactly the bottleneck that may occur, and if in fact you're going to evacuate, make sure that you take that into consideration so that you're not evacuating in a manner or at a time where it won't allow those individuals to actually get out of that problem area and get out of that potential problem area, you know, whether that's through the bottlenecks or there's low areas that are flooded. They may have not been able to open up an inbound or an outbound lane that generally is an inbound lane that they switch to an outbound. So you need to make sure you have an idea of kind of what the evacuation route and the times would be, and its general impact on when you make that call to have people evacuate. As we move into general hurricane preparations, any business owner or manager or anybody that has any responsibility to your business and or your company should have some very basic hurricane awareness. If you don't put on some type of training, you should, even at a very basic level. Ultimately, you have the responsibility for the protection of your facilities and your employees. It's highly recommended that you have pre-hurricane season planning activities. Some of those are very basic: employee preparation, making sure that you determine which members of your staff will need to carry out hurricane preparations and who can reasonably expect to be available. Understand that individuals' personal lives will be impacted as well. You need to make sure that you do an adequate job on from a due diligence standpoint to looking at your team members and the potential impact of that and resulting situations or circumstances outside of the workplace that might impact that individual versus another individual that you may want to put on the plan. You should always develop at least a simple written plan which incorporates a set of hurricane task assignments for your staff. We'll get into a little bit later in the presentation on some of those tasks that may be assigned to staff members to help prepare for a hurricane. Input should be solicited from all the various work centers of your facility. Again, it goes back to the comment that I made before. This isn't a one-person job to make sure that this occurs. that individual doesn't have the integral knowledge of everything within the facility generally. So that person who's responsible needs to reach out and make sure they get representation from all work centers or other departments within the facility that know their area very well, very intimately, and understand the potential impact. If you're not searching those individuals out and soliciting that information, then you're going to have a weakness in that plan. Outline the specific tasks which must be performed to protect your facility. Make sure that they're documented, make sure that everybody understands. Generally, you're talking about an emotional-filled, highly charged event, so you want to make sure that people understand and kind of react to what they need to do, as opposed to have to stop and think about that. How they're going to accomplish it, who's going to perform it, and when. It's desirable to develop teams for the various tasks. Obviously, you can get things done much more efficiently and effectively and expeditiously when you're dealing with teams and multiple individuals. So whether that's a team to help board up the facility if you need to cover some windows or glass, if that's possible, whether it's a team to secure exterior equipment that you have that's about on your property and you need to make sure that it's tied down or strapped down, or you need to move equipment to a certain area. So make sure you enlist those team members to do that. That way, if there's any impact too, you have some flexibility on those individuals. If somebody might be impacted and not be able to respond, you have others individuals that can kind of pick up that slack. And make sure you outline your hurricane response plan and task assignment and through a training session. Ideally, that would be the best thing to do, is have a training session, whether it's a tabletop training session, a mock scenario, but it's best to make sure that you have that plan at least identified and you do some type of training. Generally, the most efficient way and cost-conscious way would be to do a tabletop exercise, but if you want to take it to a full-blown mock exercise, that's even more ideal. So let's talk a little bit about facility and preparation. If your facility is in a storm surge zone, you need to make sure, or it appears to be unsafe for occupancy during high winds, even if it's not in a storm surge area. You should, or you may have to actually completely evacuate it. You need to make sure, and based upon identifying those zones that we talked about a few slides ago, you'll kind of have an idea of what you need to do and what your course of action would be. Review the list of major equipment and furnishings to determine which items need to be protected or removed, and record how you plan to do that. What needs to be done? Do you need additional outside resources to help get that equipment moved or furnishings moved or documented it? You know, protect that equipment in place or move them out of the area which is at risk. Identify any outside equipment and furnishings which can be blown loose. One of the things with the high winds, you don't want your facility to be damaged or individuals to be hurt as a result of items that are loose that may be blown about due to the high winds and become ultimately, deadly missiles during hurricane winds. Determine where they will be stored and how they will be secured in place. Strongly anchor any portable storage buildings as well. And make sure your rooftop equipment, for example, exhaust fans or wind turbines or air conditioning units, you may have to apply additional fastening to secure them or strap them down on a roof deck to make sure that they are not torn off the roof or become a part of that debris as a result of the high winds. If you have a roof that's a composition roof with gravel covering, it would be ideal if you could remove that loose gravel so that it's not blown about as well and result in damage to unprotected windows because that gravel was actually airborne as a result of the winds. And make sure that members of your staff know how to turn off electrical power where water shutoffs and gas shutoffs are, and utility services are within your building at main switches, as well as within the building and off the property that may be fed. And the important part of kind of identifying all this equipment and information, not only to help protect it, and then also assist in making sure that it doesn't become something that causes damage as a result of the winds and it tearing away, but also from an insurance standpoint, you want to be able to make sure that you in fact document all the information that you have, the equipment that you have, should you need to file some type of claim. As you look at the equipment, you may have battery operated radios or spare batteries on hand to make sure that you can receive emergency information, whether that's emergency information from the grounds itself or from an agency that's providing updates. And it's desirable to have at least one radio on site that can receive the NOAA weather radio frequency so that you can understand kind of where the storm's at, the intensity level, what they predict as far as how fast the storm is moving, things of that nature. And make sure that you get enough flashlights or other battery-powered lights to allow essential work to be conducted. If you have a power outage and you need to make sure that you're getting work completed, whether that's a flashlight, whether that's a generator that's supplying power to mobile light trees, whatever the case may be, make sure that you have sufficient lighting in place. And then look at compiling a disaster supply kit and have it ready for emergencies, whether that's medical supplies, water, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of resources out there that will help you put together a disaster supply kit. Look at the items that should be, the contents of that supply kit, and ready for those emergency situations. If there aren't storm shutters that you have, there aren't many that organizations that do, make sure you have the necessary tools to board up windows and brace doors, whether that's the power equipment, the raw material itself to make sure that you can do so, the individuals assigned and aligned to get that done. And the first priority, again, is going to protect your facility. Try to be able to keep the wind out, create additional interior damage, and making sure that you're protecting those employees that might be there and engaged in your disaster response plan. Some of the things you should look, I mentioned the raw materials, plywood, preferably you want to go 5/8 of an inch thick to cover large windows and or glass doors. It can be blown in by hurricane force winds. There are some facilities that may have security or hardened glass and or entrances, but you want to make sure that those areas can sustain those high winds as well. If possible, obtain that plywood before hurricane season begins. Get it pre-cut to size. You don't want to have to be in a situation where you're not able to adequately cover those areas as a result of the material that you have isn't sized properly, or you need to take the time you don't want to take the time to have to cut down that size. And that way you can actually number those things and identify where each goes and then store it so that you can quickly get it put into place. Wind pressure and wind-blown debris can break a lot of windows and doors that are in place, so that's why it's important that you have some type of covering on them, which can cause a lot of damage to the property as well as individuals. And make sure that you have an ample supply of brooms, mops, absorbents to remove any water. A small generator is ideal so that if power goes out for an extended period of time before a hurricane comes, even before it makes landfall and comes ashore, there might be an interruption of power, so you need to make sure that you have some type of backup generator or backup power supply in place. A generator can provide the capability to maintain minimal things like lighting and recharge battery-powered equipment and power pumps that may be used to move water as a result, and have those tools that are needed for those expedient repairs or getting your facility prepared to to withstand a strike of a Category 3 or higher hurricane. You should also look at making sure that you have enough lumber to brace inward, opening exterior doors. Any roll-up doors that you have on the sides, boards should be placed, should be 2x4s or larger when you're looking at that, so that they can withstand the pressure. Waterproof tape or a duct tape or filament tape can help protect the smaller windows in your facility. So if you want to put some type of tape over those windows, won't prevent them necessarily from breaking, but may help with items becoming airborne as a result of that break. You want to tie down the material either through a rope or a chain for any outside furnishings or equipment that can't be moved. Heavy-duty plastic sheeting or furring strips, nail guns, staple gun that you have to be used to make expedient roof and window repairs, so that if you are in a situation where you have something, you can get that repaired quickly so that you don't sustain additional damage inside the facility as a result of that broken window or that roof, whatever the case may be. An ample supply of sandbags to help prevent intrusion of the water through doorways or low-lying sections of building. And there are many times where we know of companies that may have a sandbag filling party, for lack of a better term, where you have all that information and or a material, I should say, taken care of. It's an inclusive kind of event for everybody, kind of gets everybody on that same page as it relates to thinking about and preparing for it and executing on the disaster plan. So a hurricane watch is issued. So what does that mean to you? Some of the precautionary activities, you should refer to your task assignments for a hurricane if a watch is initiated. Begin some of your pre-planning activities. Unlike some other natural disasters that do occur, you do have some amount of time and available to make some preparations as hurricanes approach. So you should take good advantage of that time. Monitor radio and television and newscasts for further information. These storms have a tendency to change direction quickly. So even if you're not in that cone or that path, that projected path, if you're outside of that, you should probably be taking the same type of considerations as a result, or should that storm change direction quickly. You want to check and verify the adequacy of essential emergency equipment and supplies. Don't go to a fire extinguisher and notice that it hasn't been charged or it hasn't been checked lately when you're trying to deal with a fire that's been started as a result of the storm, or that you have, as I mentioned earlier, batteries or things of that nature that are drawn down as a result of not charging, and making sure that you have all those essential supplies and emergency equipment available to you. You want to make sure to secure or store that exterior equipment. Again, this is the third or fourth time that you've heard me say that. That's extremely important because you don't want that type of equipment creating additional damage or have to deal with additional damage or a whole completely different new scenario as a result of equipment that hasn't been properly secured. Where if it would have, the damage or impact may have been very minimal, but as a result of not taking that step, you have to deal with a much larger and more impactful event. Assemble the equipment and materials to protect those windows, other glass by boarding up and taping up. Fill vehicles with fuel. Make sure you have enough fuel for an emergency generator. If you don't have fuel stored on site, make sure that you have a process in place to make sure that you can get that fuel quickly as you're preparing and taking advantage of that time ahead of the storm approaching. The other thing to take into consideration too is that fuel just may not be available during a hurricane or your evacuation activity. So make sure that if you don't have on-site fuel storage, you have some mechanism in place that you could get to that if it's not available or readily available in the surrounding area. Begin storing water in containers for emergency use, whether that's emergency use because you have you use water as part of your processes, or you need to get bottled water for individuals to consume who are dealing with the situation, or in fact you have other needs within your processes for any type of water, whether that's potable water or not. Update your list for all business records, and that can be moved. If you don't do an offsite storage or you don't have storage of your information in the cloud, make sure that the computer data is backed up and that you have the adequate way to restore that information should it be compromised. In general, basically, businesses in evacuation zones should be evacuated promptly when hurricane warnings are issued. This is sometimes a local call that's made by a management team or the facility itself on when they evacuate, but in general, if you're given an evacuation order, it's probably best that you heed that order and that recommendation. Close the business, relocate those vital records and valuables, relocate equipment out of the area if you can. That would be ideal. Move furnishing away from exterior windows and doors. Kind of centralize that information within four walls if you can. And get items off the floor if you're concerned about flooding or the storm surge. As well as close, lock, and board up large windows and glass doors, as I mentioned. Ensure all personnel have departed the facility. You need to make sure that you have somebody identified to do a sweep of the facility if you do an evacuation. What's your head count process? How do you have people check in? Things of that nature as you're looking at your plan and making sure that if in fact you do evacuate, that you've taken into consideration everybody and the potential to make sure that you don't leave individuals behind, so to speak. So you have a warning. It's gone from a watch now to a warning is issued. If an evacuation is not recommended, take the appropriate protective measures to reduce the vulnerability of the wind damage. Have building maintenance personnel on standby and materials ready to go. Prepare for a possible loss of utilities for anywhere up to 2 to 3 days. It may take, there may be a lot of pressure put on those utility companies to get customers back in service. So you need to make sure that you have adequate preparations for at least a 3-day period as well before those services come back online. If your facility isn't in an evacuation area, but is still expected to receive some type of storm effects, use interior rooms and corridors when you house people and or move individuals within the interior. In a multi-story building, shelter people on the lower floors. Avoid corner rooms. Again, centrally locate where you have the most protection. Avoid areas near exterior windows and glass doors. Common sense tells you you don't want to be around those glass doors or windows should they break and you have flying glass. Periodically, you need to conduct an internal check of the building to make sure that you have you're sound and structurally sound. Ensure that those being sheltered remain indoors. Don't let those individuals leave the property or the building itself. And then it's always good to check with your legal counsel, whether that's an in-house legal counsel or external legal counsel, to determine potential liability before using your facility as a hurricane shelter. So if you put your facility out there as a hurricane shelter, not only for you, but for others, make sure that you've at least done the due diligence on the legal side to make sure that you understand the impact of that action. So you prepare for the hurricane, you have a plan, you initiate that plan, it works, you hopefully limit the negative impact to your business, and the hurricane is over. So after a hurricane, if you've evacuated your facility, you may have difficulty returning to it quickly, whether that's because roads they're not accessible, or it's not accessible due to damage or fallen trees, or your building was impacted where you may have to bring someone in to review it from a structural standpoint, some type of engineering firm before you'd allow people back in. You need to assess the storm damage areas that may be limited by local law enforcement personnel as well. Entry to storm damaged areas may be limited just to search and rescue personnel, law enforcement personnel, firefighters, utility crews, things of that nature. So understand exactly what stage or at what point you may be able to return to your facility. Obviously, you want to look for any of that structural damage, as I mentioned. Again, you need to bring in an outside firm to do that. It's probably best to do that. Check for downed or dangling electrical power lines or broken sewer or water pipes on your property. And then the biggest thing is, if you can secure it, get some type of security measure in place to help secure the property. You want to secure it from potential looting, but also making sure that individuals aren't coming onto the property that shouldn't be. Employees that might be returning that want to try to return to the workspace to get something that you haven't been cleared for those individuals to return, whether it's controlling media, whether it's helping control emergency vehicles, whatever the case may be. But you should have some aspect of a security provision within your plan as well. Recovery activity, you want to document damage to your building and its contents with photographs or videos. Again, this is important from an insurance perspective. You need to make sure that you report that damage quickly and provide all the information that's required by the policies that you have in place. And if possible, if you need an adjuster to come out to take a look at the damage to the property, you should always have a representative or someone present there with that adjuster when they inspect the property. Repair damage to sprinkler systems as soon as possible. You need to make sure that you get fire protection equipment back in service quickly. Contact your local building inspection officials, determine permit requirements that may be needed, inspections that may be needed, variances that may be granted as well, and rebuilding guidelines after a disaster should you find yourself in a position where you have to make structural repairs and or rebuild. So the bottom line in all this planning and what you're trying to do is you have to understand, it's just like anything else. You have to know your risks. And if you know your risks, you're in a much better place, in a position to know what to do based upon those risks. So whether that's you go through a formalized risk assessment process, or you take a very a less structured approach and just kind of understanding your potential risks, you should have some idea, because that'll help guide you and help develop what you need to do and to what extent you need to build this plan, what impact you have not only on your employees but the community, those others that are around, and then also understand who it is that you need to involve the plan. If you need to contact your local emergency management office to learn about evacuation routes, it'll allow you to do that, or the emergency plans that they have. Many municipalities or governmental agencies have some emergency plans or guidelines in place. So if you don't have a plan and it's a white piece of paper that you're looking at, know that you might be able to turn to some of those agencies to get some type of plan, or a third-party organization that would come in to help you draft that plan or have some type of template. You should always get that additional information from the Federal Emergency Management Association. The FEMA.gov website is a great resource, as well as the READY campaign, which is ready.gov. Citizens Corps, which is citizencorp.gov, as well as the Red Cross, are invaluable resources to pull upon, as well as NOAA's National Hurricane Weather Center, which I've provided the URL there and the link for that Hurricane Center as well. Make a disaster plan that includes your employees. It's extremely important, and if I haven't said it enough, make your plan inclusive. Not only to employees, but the impact of any guests that you may have. Make sure that your employees understand how to treat those guests or visitors that might be on the property during some type of event. Make sure that you have contacts and locations to reunite if people become separated. Phone trees, contact information, personal information is on hand, whether that's through the HR department or someone else within the facility that knows how to reach out and get in touch with not only employees, but as well as family members, contacts for if in fact something were to occur to those individuals. Make sure that you have that information up to speed. I know that HR departments are continually going through that process and making sure that they do that, but it's essential that you have that accurate and up-to-date information, especially during this event. And then again, assemble that supply kit, whether that's large machinery, whether that's small items such as medical equipment, whether that's water, whether it's additional resources like the plywood to cover windows, whether it's generators, whatever the case may be, you should have some type of supply kit that's put together. It doesn't have to be for everyone. If you even boil it down to, here's kind of a supply kit by an individuals, you can do that as well, but have something at least on hand located throughout the facility if you have a large facility where people can get to it quickly. You don't want to have those supply kits in just one central location where it may be difficult for somebody to get to them. And then make sure that you gather those important documents. Again, many organizations are moved away from paper documents and gone electronic, but make sure that you gather that information. Make sure that you have the adequate backup. When was the last time that your systems were backed up? Involve your IT and your information security group as well to make sure that you have all that information, so that if in fact you do and unfortunately are impacted on a pretty significant, from a significant standpoint, that you're able to get that information back and get up and running quickly. So I know we only had an hour assigned for this. Obviously, there's a lot of points within this presentation and this webinar that you probably saw that could be expanded upon and spend a lot of time as you drill down into those. This is kind of an overview of kind of what to expect. If you have any questions, you want some more information about certain items within the presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll be glad to assist in any way. And if you have any other questions, you can reach me through the contact information as well. That I'll supply here. I know that there was a question about kind of the Pacific Ocean as well. Obviously, hurricanes aren't just or don't just occur in the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. Obviously, there's an impact. This presentation really doesn't, I know that it's identified in there as far as those areas, those geographic areas, but the general basis of the information here applies to anything, whether you're on the West Coast, Southwest, Northeast. Obviously, those individuals in New York didn't expect Sandy to hit as it would or as it did. So this really applies to any geographic area that you're in. So with that as well, I know that if you have any questions, I've put on here my contact information as well. You can call us direct, access any of the resources, or get any information through our website, or my email address is located there as well. If you want a copy of the presentation, I'd be glad to provide that if you request that, and follow up with any additional questions. All right. I don't see any other questions coming through. So with that, I appreciate and thank everybody for attending, and I hope that you have a great afternoon. I hope that you sit down and put that plan together, and I also hope that you never have to put it into play. Thanks again.